I didn't buy the radio because I needed one. I bought it because it wouldn't stop staring at me. It was sitting on a dusty shelf in the corner of a thrift store, the kind of place that smells like old wood, wet cardboard, and forgotten decades. At first glance it looked normal. A small tabletop radio. Wooden casing. Rounded edges. A cracked glass dial that listed frequencies from long-dead stations. But something about it felt wrong. Not broken. Not creepy. Just wrong. Like an object that had somehow ended up in the wrong timeline. The store owner noticed me staring. "That one still works," he said casually from behind the counter. His voice startled me. I hadn't even realized he was watching. I turned the radio slightly in my hands. It was heavier than I expected. "What year is this thing from?" I asked. He shrugged. "50s. Maybe earlier." The dial numbers were faded but still readable. AM bands mostly. A few markings scratched next to certain frequencies. Someone had used a knife or a key to carve tiny lines into the metal. I pointed at them. "Did someone mark these?" The owner leaned forward. For the first time his expression changed slightly. Not fear. More like discomfort. "Probably the last guy who owned it. Why'd he sell it?" A pause. Too long for such a simple question. "He didn't." That answer hung in the air. I waited for him to explain. He didn't. Instead he said something else. "You want it?" I laughed awkwardly. "How much?" $20. It should have been more. Vintage radios usually are. But I didn't argue. Something about the object made me curious in the way a locked door does. You know you shouldn't open it, but you still want to know what's behind it. I paid. He wrapped it in old newspaper, and as he handed it over he said something strange. Not threatening. Not dramatic. Just oddly specific. "Don't listen to it after midnight." I chuckled. "Why?" He didn't smile. "Just don't." My apartment was small. 1 bedroom. Thin walls. The kind of place where you can hear your neighbors arguing through the vents. I set the radio on the kitchen table and plugged it in. Nothing happened at first. No light. No hum. Just silence. I turned the dial slowly. Static exploded from the speaker. Loud enough to make me flinch. Good. That meant it worked. I rotated the frequency knob. Station after station. Music. Talk shows. Static again. Normal. Completely normal. Eventually I turned it off and went to bed. I forgot about the old man's warning. Forgot about the carved frequencies. Forgot about the radio entirely. Until the first night it turned on by itself. It was 12:17 a.m. I know that because the light from my digital clock was the only thing illuminating the room. I woke up to the sound of static. Soft at first. Then louder. My heart jumped as I realized where it was coming from. The kitchen. I sat up in bed. Listening. Static crackled through the apartment like distant rain. I got up slowly and walked into the kitchen. The radio was on. The dial hadn't moved. The knob hadn't turned. But the speaker was alive with white noise. I stepped closer, reaching for the power switch. Then the static stopped. Dead silence filled the room. For a moment I thought it had shut off. Then a voice came through. Low. Distorted. Barely human through the crackling signal. "Tomorrow." I froze. The voice continued. Slow. Mechanical. Like someone reading from a script they didn't fully understand. "Tomorrow, at 8:42 a.m. The radio crackled again. "A red car will run the intersection on Halston Street." My stomach tightened. Halston Street was 3 blocks from my apartment. The voice kept going. 1 driver injured. Another burst of static. 1 passenger dead. My hand hovered over the switch. I shut the radio off immediately. The apartment went silent again. I stood there for a long time, listening to nothing. Eventually I laughed nervously. Probably some weird late-night broadcast. Old radio interference. Numbers station. Pirate signal. Something like that. People hear strange things on radios all the time. I went back to bed. And by morning, I had almost convinced myself it was just a coincidence. Until 8:42 a.m., when I heard sirens outside my apartment. The sirens didn't stop. At first I ignored them. Sirens in the city aren't unusual. You hear them all the time. Ambulances. Police. Fire trucks. Just background noise of living somewhere crowded. But these sirens stayed. They echoed down my street for almost 5 minutes. Something about that bothered me. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside. 2 police cars had blocked the intersection on Halston Street, exactly where the radio had mentioned. People were gathering on the sidewalk. Someone had already pulled out their phone and started recording. I walked closer. A red sedan had smashed into the side of a gray SUV. The front of the red car was completely destroyed. Glass everywhere. Smoke drifting lazily from the hood. Paramedics were pulling someone out of the passenger seat of the SUV. A woman. Her body hung limp between them. Someone next to me whispered quietly, "Jesus!" Another person asked, "Is she alive?" One of the paramedics shook his head. That was enough. The crowd fell silent. I felt something cold crawl up my spine. Because the radio hadn't just predicted an accident. It had described it perfectly. Red car. Halston Street. 8:42 a.m. 1 injured. 1 dead. Every detail. Exactly right. I stood there longer than I should have. My brain trying to force logic into something that didn't make sense. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe the broadcast had reported an accident that already happened earlier somewhere else. Maybe I misheard the time. Maybe. But the excuses felt thin. Paper thin. And when I walked back to my apartment, the radio was still sitting on the kitchen table. Exactly where I left it. Quiet. Innocent. Like it had nothing to do with any of this. I tried not to think about it the rest of the day. I went to work. Answered emails. Sat through a meeting I barely paid attention to. But the thought kept creeping back. 12:17 a.m. The voice. The prediction. By the time I got home that night, I had convinced myself of one thing. I needed to hear it again. Not because I believed it. Because I needed to prove it wrong. I waited. Watched the clock. 11:50 p.m. 11:58 p.m. 12:04 a.m. The apartment felt quieter than usual. Like the walls themselves were listening. 12:16 a.m. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the radio. Hand resting near the switch. Then the clock changed. 12:17 a.m. And the radio turned on. By itself. Static burst into the room. Louder than the night before. Sharpened by the silence. I leaned closer. Heart already beating faster. The static continued for a few seconds. Then the voice came back. Distorted. Low. Calm. Tomorrow. My throat tightened. The voice sounded clearer this time. Closer. Like the signal had improved. Tomorrow. 6:14 p.m. The speaker crackled. 3rd floor apartment. My pulse jumped. I lived on the 3rd floor. Kitchen fire. The static hissed again. Caused by unattended stove. I stared at the radio. Frozen. The voice continued. One resident hospitalized. A pause. Longer this time. Then the final sentence. Apartment 3B. My stomach dropped. That was my apartment. The radio clicked. And the static returned. I shut it off immediately. My hand shaking. Because suddenly I remembered something. Something small. Something stupid. Something I had completely forgotten. Earlier that evening, I had left a pot on the stove. For a moment I didn't move. My brain refused to process what I had just heard. Apartment 3B. Kitchen fire. Unattended stove. 6:14 p.m. tomorrow. My apartment. My stove. My mistake. I slowly turned my head toward the kitchen. The pot was still there, sitting quietly on the burner. Cold. Harmless. I walked over and checked it. The stove was off. Of course it was. I must have turned it off earlier. Or maybe it never was on. My hands were shaking too much to remember. I lifted the pot anyway and set it in the sink. Then I stepped back and stared at the stove like it was some kind of bomb. Okay, I whispered to myself. Okay, that's easy. If the fire was caused by an unattended stove, then I just wouldn't leave the stove unattended. Problem solved. Right. I went to bed trying to convince myself that this was proof the radio was wrong. Because now I knew. Now I could prevent it. The next day I became obsessed. Every few minutes I checked the stove. Before work. Before leaving the apartment. Before locking the door. I even took a picture of the stove on my phone. Just so I could look at it later and confirm it was off. When I arrived at work I checked the picture 3 times. Burners off. Knobs turned all the way. Nothing on the stove. No fire. No accident. The radio had to be wrong. All I had to do was wait until 6:14 p.m. Once that time passed, the whole thing would be proven false. Just some bizarre coincidence. My brain playing tricks on me. That's what I told myself. Over and over again. 5:30 p.m. I left work early. I wanted to be home. I wanted to see the moment the prediction failed. When I entered the apartment, the first thing I did was check the kitchen. Stove off. Still cold. I laughed nervously. You see? I said out loud. Nothing. The apartment was silent. I sat at the kitchen table. The radio sitting in front of me like it was watching. 5:47 p.m. 6:01 p.m. 6:10 p.m. 4 minutes left. My heart was beating faster than it should have. I kept staring at the stove, waiting for something impossible to happen. 6:13 p.m. 1 minute. I stood up, walked over, placed my hand directly on the burner. Cold metal. Nothing else. 6:14 p.m. The second passed. Then another. Nothing happened. No fire. No smoke. No alarms. I let out a shaky breath and laughed. See? I said again. This thing is. A sharp smell cut through the air. Burning. I froze. The smell wasn't coming from the stove. It was coming from behind me. From the living room. I turned slowly. My couch was on fire. Flames crawling up the side like hungry fingers. I stared at it in disbelief. How? Then I saw it. The extension cord running under the couch. Blackened. Sparking. Something must have shorted. Electric fire. My heart slammed into my ribs. The radio hadn't said the stove would be on. It had said the fire would be caused by an unattended stove. And suddenly I realized something horrifying. The stove wasn't the problem. The problem was that I left the apartment earlier that day, and no one had been here to stop anything. The smoke alarm exploded into life. The room filled with smoke. I grabbed my phone and ran into the hallway. Neighbors were already shouting. Someone pulled the fire alarm. Sirens in the distance. And as I stood there coughing in the hallway, one thought slowly pushed its way through my mind. The radio had been right again. Exactly right. And I hadn't stopped it. I had just misunderstood it. The fire department arrived fast. Faster than I expected. Within minutes, the hallway was filled with firefighters shouting instructions and dragging hoses through the smoke. Someone pushed me toward the stairwell. "Sir, you need to move downstairs." I didn't argue. My lungs burned from the smoke and my eyes were watering so badly I could barely see. By the time we reached the street, a small crowd had gathered outside the building. People wrapped in blankets. Neighbors in pajamas. The usual chaos that follows any emergency. I sat on the curb trying to catch my breath, watching the firefighters disappear into the building. The smoke pouring from my third-floor window looked worse from outside. Thicker. Darker. A paramedic crouched in front of me. "Were you inside when it started?" "Yeah," I said hoarsely. "Do you feel dizzy? Any burns?" I shook my head. "No. I got out fast." He nodded and shined a small light into my eyes. "You're lucky." Lucky. That word stuck with me. Because the radio had said, "One resident hospitalized." Not dead. Hospitalized. And suddenly I realized something strange. That prediction hadn't happened yet. 2 hours later I was sitting in the back of an ambulance. Not because of burns. Because of smoke inhalation. My breathing had gotten worse while I waited outside. The paramedics insisted I come in. "Just precautionary," they said. I didn't argue. I was too tired. Too shaken. As the ambulance doors closed, I looked back at the apartment building. Flashing lights everywhere. Police cars. Fire trucks. And my window. Blackened. Broken. The couch inside had been completely destroyed. The rest of the apartment had smoke damage. One of the firefighters told me quietly, "You're not going back there tonight." The hospital room was small. White walls. Fluorescent lights humming quietly above me. A plastic oxygen tube rested under my nose. The doctor said I'd be fine. Just observation overnight. I laid there staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of everything. The accident that morning. The fire. The radio predicting both. 2 perfect predictions. 2 disasters. Both unavoidable. Unless. That thought stopped me cold. What if the radio wasn't predicting the future? What if it was describing something else? Something already decided. Something that was going to happen no matter what I did. I barely slept that night. The hospital hallway was quiet except for the occasional footsteps of nurses. My phone said 12:16 a.m. My chest tightened. The radio wasn't here. It was still back in my apartment. Probably burned. Or soaked. Or sitting somewhere under blackened furniture. But that didn't matter. The voice wouldn't come tonight. There was no radio. No signal. No prediction. For the first time since I bought it, I might actually get a peaceful night. The clock on the wall changed. 12:17 a.m. And somewhere in the hospital room, static began to crackle. My blood turned to ice. Because the sound wasn't coming from the hallway. And it wasn't coming from my phone. It was coming from the small hospital television mounted on the wall. The screen flickered. Static filled the display. The speaker crackled loudly. And then the voice returned, clearer than it had ever been before. Tomorrow. I sat up slowly in the hospital bed, heart pounding. The voice continued. Tomorrow. 9:03 p.m. The static hissed. Room 214. I looked at the number on the wall beside my bed. My stomach dropped. The voice finished the sentence calmly. Cardiac arrest. My hands started shaking. The static grew louder. Then the final words came through the speaker. 1 patient dead. For a few seconds I couldn't breathe. Not because of the smoke damage in my lungs. Because of what I had just heard. Room 214. Cardiac arrest. 1 patient dead. 9:03 p.m. tomorrow. I slowly turned my head toward the number on the wall again. My room. My hospital bed. My heart started pounding so hard it hurt. No, I whispered. No, no, no. This wasn't possible. The radio had been destroyed. Left behind in a burned apartment. There was no way it could be broadcasting through a hospital television. Unless the device had never been the source at all. Unless the radio had only been the door. And now something else had stepped through it. I grabbed the remote and turned the television off. The screen went black instantly. Silence returned to the room. But the silence didn't make me feel better. Because the message had already been delivered. And the last 2 predictions had come true. Perfectly. The next morning the doctor told me I could leave. Your lungs look good, he said. You were lucky. Lucky again. Everyone kept saying that word. Lucky. I nodded politely while signing the discharge papers. Inside my head one thought kept repeating. 9:03 p.m. If I was dead by then nothing else mattered. By the afternoon I was back at my apartment building. The 3rd floor still smelled like smoke. My door hung crooked on its hinges. A firefighter had forced it open during the fire. Inside, the place looked worse than I expected. The couch was gone. Just a burned skeleton of metal springs. Black stains covered the walls. Ash everywhere. But something caught my attention immediately. The kitchen table. The radio was still sitting there. Completely untouched. No burn marks. No melted plastic. No damage at all. It looked exactly the same as the day I bought it. Quiet. Patient. Waiting. I walked toward it slowly. Every step felt heavier. Like I was approaching something alive. My hand hovered over the power knob. I didn't turn it. Instead, I leaned down and looked closely at the dial. The scratched frequency markings were still there. Tiny lines carved beside certain stations. I hadn't paid much attention to them before. But now I counted them. 4 marks. 4 frequencies. 2 predictions had already happened. The accident. The fire. Maybe the marks were a list. Maybe each one was a future event. I turned the dial carefully. The first marked frequency produced nothing but static. The second one too. But when the needle reached the 3rd carved mark, the speaker came alive instantly. Static filled the kitchen. Louder than before. The voice appeared immediately. As if it had been waiting. Tonight. My heart pounded. 9:03 p.m. The radio crackled. Room 214. My throat tightened. Then the final sentence came through. Clear. Cold. Unmistakable. Cardiac arrest. I shut the radio off again. My hands trembling. Because this time the voice had said something new. Something it hadn't mentioned in the hospital. Something I couldn't stop thinking about. Just before the static returned. It had whispered 3 extra words. Words that made the blood drain from my face. Subject resists prediction. I stood in the kitchen for a long time after the radio went silent. The words kept echoing in my head. Subject resists prediction. Subject. Not man. Not person. Subject. Like I was part of an experiment. Like someone, or something, was observing me. Testing outcomes. Adjusting variables. Watching what happened when I tried to change the future. My chest tightened. Because suddenly the last 2 days made horrifying sense. The accident. The fire. Both events had still happened even when I tried to stop them. Different causes. Same result. Almost like the prediction wasn't describing a specific event. It was describing a destination. And the universe was just finding a different road to get there. I looked at the clock on my phone. 3:12 p.m. Less than 6 hours until 9:03. Less than 6 hours until the radio said I would die. Cardiac arrest. I wasn't old. I wasn't sick. I didn't have heart problems. But the voice had never been wrong before. My eyes drifted back to the radio. 4 carved marks on the dial. I had triggered the third one. Which meant there was still one more mark left. One more prediction. Something told me I didn't want to hear it. I grabbed the radio suddenly. My heart racing. "All right," I muttered. "If this thing is real, we'll see." I carried it to the sink. Filled a glass with water. Then I poured it directly over the radio. Water soaked the wooden casing. Dripped into the speaker. Ran across the dial. The radio crackled briefly. Then went silent. Dead. I waited. Nothing. No static. No voice. Just dripping water in the sink. A small laugh escaped my throat. "There," I whispered. "Problem solved." I threw the radio into the trash. Hard. The plastic bag rustled as it landed inside. For the first time in 2 days, I felt something close to relief. 7:48 p.m. I was sitting on the floor of my apartment with my phone in my hands. I hadn't eaten. Hadn't turned on the lights. I was just waiting. Watching the clock. Every minute that passed felt like progress. Like I was slowly outrunning something chasing me. 8:12 p.m. Still alive. 8:37 p.m. Still alive. 8:51 p.m. My breathing was getting slower now. Calmer. Maybe the radio had been the source after all. Maybe destroying it had broken whatever strange chain of events had started. Maybe. The trash can moved. Just slightly. A quiet rustling sound. I froze. Slowly turning my head. The black garbage bag shifted again. My stomach twisted. "No," I whispered. "No." Something inside the bag crackled. Then came the sound I had begun to dread more than anything. Static. Soft at first. Then louder. My entire body went cold. Because the voice was coming from the trash. Adjusting variables. The static grew harsher. New outcome calculated. My pulse hammered in my ears. The voice spoke again. Slow. Precise. Cardiac event remains unavoidable. Then the last sentence came through. And it made my hands go numb. Time unchanged. I looked at the clock. 8:59 p.m. 4 minutes left. 8:59 p.m. 4 minutes. The clock on my phone felt louder than it should have. Every second that passed seemed to echo through the apartment. Tick. 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 My chest tightened. Not from pain. From fear. Because the voice had just confirmed something terrifying. Time unchanged. No matter what I did, no matter how many things I destroyed, the prediction wasn't moving. 9:03 p.m. was still coming. I stood up slowly. The trash bag in the kitchen twitched again. Static hissed softly from inside it. The radio was still talking to me. Still alive. Still calculating. Like some twisted machine trying to finish an experiment. I walked over and ripped the bag open. The radio fell onto the floor with a dull thud. Water still dripped from the casing. The speaker crackled weakly. But the voice wasn't speaking anymore. Just static. Waiting. I stared at it for a long moment. Then something strange caught my eye. The bottom panel of the radio was slightly loose. A small metal plate. Barely noticeable. I flipped the radio over. There were scratches around the screws. Like someone had opened it before. My hands moved almost automatically. I grabbed a screwdriver from the kitchen drawer and removed the panel. The plate fell away easily. Inside the radio there weren't many components. Just old wires. Dust. And something folded tightly between the circuits. A piece of paper. Yellowed with age. My fingers trembled as I pulled it out. The handwriting was messy. Hurried. Like someone had written it while panicking. It read, "If you are reading this, the radio chose you too." My breath caught in my throat. I kept reading. It predicts deaths. At first they are small events. Accidents. Strangers. Then it moves closer. Until the final prediction. My heart pounded harder. Because I already knew what the final prediction was. The note continued. You will try to stop it. You will try to break the radio. You will think you are smarter than it. You are not. A cold chill spread across my skin. The final line was written darker than the rest. Like the pen had pressed harder into the paper. I survived once. But it changed the rules. My eyes scanned the rest of the page desperately. Looking for instructions. Looking for anything that might save me. There was one last sentence at the bottom. Short. Simple. Terrifying. If the radio ever says you are the subject, it means the experiment has already ended. My hands dropped to my sides. The note slid from my fingers and landed on the floor. My eyes slowly moved toward the clock again. 9:02 p.m. 1 minute. My heart was beating harder now. Faster. Too fast. A tight pressure began forming in the center of my chest. I swallowed hard. Not real, I whispered. This isn't real. The pressure grew sharper. Like someone pressing a fist inside my ribcage. My breathing became uneven. The radio crackled again. And the voice returned one final time. Quiet. Satisfied. Prediction confirmed. The pain in my chest exploded. It wasn't gradual anymore. It was sudden. Violent. Like something inside my body had snapped. I collapsed against the kitchen counter, knocking the radio onto the floor beside me. My breath came in short, broken gasps. Air wouldn't fill my lungs. My vision blurred. The room tilted. No. I tried to move toward my phone on the table. My hand barely lifted before dropping again. The pressure in my chest spread into my arm. Up my neck. Into my jaw. Some distant part of my mind recognized the symptoms. Heart attack. Cardiac arrest. Exactly what the radio had said. 9:03 p.m. The clock on my phone changed. 9:03. The second it happened, the radio stopped crackling. Total silence filled the apartment. Like the experiment had finally reached its conclusion. I fell to the floor. Cold towel pressing against my cheek. The ceiling above me spun slowly. Dark spots crept into the edges of my vision. And then the radio spoke one last time. Not distorted. Not mechanical. Clear. Perfect. Subject terminated. My body twitched weakly. I tried to breathe. But the air wouldn't come. The voice continued calmly. Prediction accuracy confirmed. My vision was almost gone now. The kitchen lights fading into darkness. Data recorded. The radio clicked softly. Then something new happened. Something that made my fading mind struggle to understand. Another voice joined the signal. Different. Human. Curious. A man speaking calmly, like a scientist reviewing results. Remarkable. Papers shuffled faintly through the speaker. Another voice answered him. A woman this time. Third subject lasted longer than expected. The man hummed thoughtfully. Yes. Resistance behavior improved the data. My chest spasmed weakly. My heart barely beating now. The voices continued talking. Like I wasn't even there. Prediction chain held perfectly? Yes. Fatal outcome remained fixed? Correct. A pause. Then the man spoke again. Satisfied. Good. More paper shuffling. Then the final sentence I would ever hear. Prepare the device for the next subject. The radio clicked. Static returned. My vision finally collapsed into darkness. 2 weeks later, the thrift store owner placed the radio back on the shelf. Cleaned. Quiet. Waiting. A young man walked into the store, browsing slowly. His eyes eventually landed on the radio. He picked it up, turned it in his hands. Does this thing still work? He asked. The owner looked up from the counter, and after a short pause, he answered the same way he always did. Yes. Then he added softly, just don't listen to it after midnight. And if you ever hear a voice on the radio predicting the future, remember something. It might not be trying to warn you. It might just be recording the experiment. Sleep carefully tonight.